I was talking to an Army officer who had been at the camp where Elvis Presley is. All of the kidding and the ribbing about getting his hair cut and all of that, he took it all like a drum major.
Just prior to his death, legendary television host Ed Sullivan let a bombshell fall. He announced the 6 singers he really disliked most. Celebrating the launch of some of the largest music careers, Sullivan's scandalous list surprised fans and insiders equally. Who did make it, and why was he so intensely in disdain? Get ready to expose the seedy underbelly of a music legend's dying revelations. Elvis Presley. In American popular culture history, few are as iconic or as scandalous as Elvis Presley's on-air performances on The Ed Sullivan Show. But in the wings, the journey to these momentous broadcasts was hardly easy. The man calling the shots, Ed Sullivan himself, was initially very resistant to having the young rocker appear on his primetime variety show, and his reluctance wasn't foolish. Sullivan was a fixture of American television during the 1950s and 60s. His Sunday evening presentation opened the eyes of millions of homes to up-and-coming performers, comedians, actors, and novelty acts. But Sullivan was also a man of rigid decorum and traditional values. His show was planned for family-friendly viewing, and he stood watch over its reputation like a champion lioness. So when Elvis Presley burst onto the national scene with his raucous rhythm, bluesy voice, and particularly his scandalous hip gyrations, Sullivan wasn't merely skeptical, but appalled. At the time, Elvis had already caused a flap with appearances on other TV shows, such as The Milton Berle Show and The Steve Allen Show. During his appearance on Berle's show in June of 1956, Elvis sang Hound Dog and accompanied the tune with over-the-top hip thrusts and slow grinding dances. The moves were protested by outraged conservative TV viewers, parents, and clergymen throughout America. The act was criticized as vulgar, animalistic, and suggestive. Sullivan, always image-conscious and loyal to his show's wholesome reputation, registered the fact and publicly announced that he had no desire to invite Elvis onto his stage. But Ed Sullivan's position was about to be put to the test by one consideration that routinely overrides moral indignation in show business: ratings. The American people couldn't get enough of Elvis Presley. His performances shocked the establishment, but delighted millions of teenagers and young adults. Elvis's appearance on the Steve Allen Show following the Burley Flap brought that show record viewership, beating Sullivan's own show ratings for the evening. That was the turning point. Sullivan's producer, Marlo Lewis, caught on to the commercial potential and pressured Sullivan to change his ways. Money talks, and pretty soon so did Sullivan. In a widely publicized flip-flop, the host presented Elvis with an offer of 3 performances on The Ed Sullivan Show for the then astronomically large sum of $50,000, the largest fee ever paid to an entertainer for that program at the time. But even in concession, Sullivan drew lines. He assured it would be made clear to Elvis that his performances would be watched very closely and that the cameras would never show any offending lower body movements. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show for the first time on September 9th, 1956, he sang Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. The show attracted an estimated 60 million viewers, an awesome 82.6% of the viewing public. The performance, however muted from his previous appearances, continued to shock the audience and cement his stardom. Sullivan, seemingly taken aback by the favorable reception and the enormous ratings, started softening. He brought Elvis back twice more, October 28, 1956 and January 6, 1957. In these later performances, Presley appeared more conscious of his movements and behaved with more restraint. But the force of his voice and charisma could not be restrained by camera shots or censorship. By the time of his last appearance on the program, Sullivan had become a convert of sorts. Following Presley's final appearance in January of 1957, Sullivan faced the camera and announced, "This is a real, decent, fine boy, and wherever you go, Elvis, we want you to know that you have the real endorsement of the Ed Sullivan Show." A dramatic pronouncement given Sullivan's previous insistence upon not having the singer appear on his show at all. It was also a reflection of a larger truth concerning the media in America during the 1950s. The tide was turning. The culture was changing at breakneck speed, guided by a younger generation that demanded music that expressed their interests, their rebellion, and their beat. Elvis Presley was the face of that change, and Ed Sullivan, wittingly or unwittingly, paved the way for it to enter America's living rooms. Ironically, in attempting to corral Presley's energy, Sullivan himself gave a sort of legitimacy to rock and roll. The Ed Sullivan Show had been for years a guardian of mainstream sensibility. In presenting Elvis, the show opened the way to something new, something more vibrant, more aggressive, and more youth-oriented than anything that had existed previously. And the impact of those performances is impossible to exaggerate. For Elvis, being on Sullivan's show was not merely a popularity boost. It was a coronation, national in scope. He became not only a teen idol, but a cultural phenomenon. His status as king of rock and roll was not formally defined by Sullivan, but the stage Sullivan gave him certainly helped to crown him. For Sullivan, the experiences with Elvis became two of the most celebrated in the long history of the show. Although he was resistant at first, he finally came to accept Presley's role in American entertainment. In the process, he also broke what was possible on television, literally setting the stage for decades of musical innovation to come. Buddy Holly in the pantheon of early rock and roll heroes. Buddy Holly is one of the most influential of the genre's pioneers. With his thick-rimmed glasses, hiccup vocal delivery, and genre-defining singles such as Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, Holly defined the sound and ethos of 1950s rock. But his rapid ascent wasn't without tension, particularly with the most influential tastemaker of the time, Ed Sullivan. Their meeting wasn't merely a confluence of a budding star and a well-established media behemoth. It was a generation conflict of rebellion versus restraint, youth versus establishment, and the stakes came to a head on an ill-fated night when Buddy Holly and his band, the Crickets, performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. By the time Buddy Holly received an invitation to perform on Sullivan's legendary Sunday night variety program, Ed Sullivan Show had already gained a national status with its enormous weekly audience, and the show became America's showcase for new talent. An appearance on Sullivan's stage could launch a career as it had for such artists as Elvis Presley, but there were strings attached to the offer. Sullivan was deeply invested in the production of every aspect of the show. He cleared set lists, censored lyrics, and managed stage presentation with a meticulous, at times heavy, hand. He was steadfast in his values, endeavoring to ensure that the material in his show was appropriate for middle-class, family-oriented viewers. That never sat quite right with the new generation of artists who were just starting to push against the establishment, and few artists represented that new attitude of independent-minded rock, as well as Buddy Holly. Holly's conflict with Sullivan started with the selection of song. The Crickets were also set to play their #1 hit single, Oh Boy, a song that was already a hit among teenagers nationwide, but Sullivan objected to it. He apparently felt some lyrics were suggestive, specifically the line, All of my love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been a-missing. Though mild by today's standards, those words in 1958 were sufficient to cause eyebrows to be raised among more staid audiences, and Sullivan was nothing if not staid. Sullivan demanded that Holly substitute Oh Boy with a different, less provocative song, but Buddy Holly, already known for his quiet, confidence, and no-nonsense attitude, refused. He wasn't about to let a television host tell him what music he could or couldn't play, and he insisted that he and the Crickets would perform Oh Boy as planned or not at all. This defiance enraged Sullivan, who was known not to take kindly to artists who defied him. And from this point forward, the two men's relationship darkened considerably. Backstage, as the show loomed closer, was acrid and tense. Sullivan was said to have treated Holly coldly, refusing the customary courtesy afforded his visitors, and some versions indicate that he intentionally reduced the sound levels of the band, making their concert more difficult to hear on TV, a childish act intended to chastise